the terrifying reason NASA stopped exploring the ocean floor. During the 1960s, NASA wasn't solely focused on space. Before their gaze shifted to the stars, there was a brief yet intense interest in the ocean floor. Resources, advanced technology, and elite scientists were directed toward exploring the ocean's mysterious depths. And for a moment, it seemed humanity was on the verge of uncovering what lies in the aquatic abyss. But just as suddenly as it began, the program was discontinued. Reports vanished. Investigations were shut down. The official response? Scientific priorities were realigned. That was the excuse they gave, but the real reason the program was abandoned is terrifying and far beyond human understanding. My name is Nathaniel Carter, and until recently, I was just another scientist trying to make a name for myself at NASA. I spent years studying physics, geology, and oceanography with the ambition of gazing at the stars and discovering what lies beyond our planet. Ironically, though, the mystery that changed my life didn't come from the sky. It came from the ocean floor. Whenever people ask me why I started down this path, I could say it was the desire for knowledge, to answer questions no one else seemed willing to ask. But the truth is, it was because of my grandfather, Dr. William Carter. He died 10 years ago, taking secrets to the grave that he never shared with anyone, not even me, his only grandson. As a child, I would sit by his armchair, listening to his stories about the ocean's depths. Over time, though, I realized those stories never had endings. They always stopped midway, just as my curiosity began to push too far. When I asked what he and his team had found down there, he would fall silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Then he'd say, "Some things are best forgotten, Nathaniel. It's better that way." Afterward, he'd change the subject or retreat to his study, locking himself in for hours. Back then, I didn't understand the weight of his words. Today, after what I've discovered, I know he was trying to protect me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it all began. A few weeks ago, I went to my grandfather's old house, a Victorian structure on the outskirts of a forgotten town in Maryland. My mother had insisted I take a look at the place before we put it up for sale. She knew I had a fascination with that locked study where my grandfather had spent most of his time. "Maybe you'll find something interesting," she said, handing me the old key. The house seemed even gloomier than I remembered. The windows were covered in dust, the air damp, heavy with the smell of rotting wood and old books. As I crossed the dark hallway, I felt a familiar chill. It was as if the house had been waiting for me. His study was at the end of the upstairs hallway. The door, always locked, seemed to challenge me as I fit the key into the rusty lock. With a click, it gave way. I had never seen the room from the inside. Stepping in, it felt like I was walking into a preserved fragment of the past. The study was a mix of chaos and order. Bookshelves crammed with scientific volumes, ancient maps, and haphazardly stacked notebooks. At its center stood a heavy dark wood desk. Felt as if time had stopped there. I closed the door behind me and began to explore. My fingers brushed over an old globe, feeling the dust that had settled. There was something unsettling about the silence, as if the room had witnessed something it wished to keep secret. That's when I found the notebooks. There were several, worn and bound in cracked leather, hidden deep in a locked drawer of the desk. Alongside them was an old photograph that made me freeze. It was a black and white image of a group of researchers, all wearing uniforms with NASA's logo. But something was off. Below the familiar agency emblem was a strange mark, a circle crossed by lines, resembling a seal I'd never seen before. On the back of the photograph, my grandfather had written a single word in shaky letters: Abyss. I kept leafing through the notebooks. The entries were chaotic, written on stained pages, filled with diagrams of the ocean floor, pressure measurements, and detailed descriptions of something seemingly impossible. Certain phrases appeared repeatedly, like a mantra: unknown depth, anomaly detected, maximum precaution. That's when I found a map, folded and worn with age. It was marked with coordinates, though they'd been heavily scratched out. Still, I could make out a name written in the margin. Mariana Trench, the deepest point in the ocean, a darkness stretching over 11,000 meters below the surface. I knew what that place represented. Since the 1960s, the ocean's depths had been the site of strange, unexplained expeditions, many of them never made public. Official reports cited technical failures, bad weather, or budget cuts. But my grandfather had been involved, and his documents suggested something far different. In that moment, something within me solidified. Perhaps it was scientific curiosity, loyalty to my grandfather, or the simple fact that the world didn't know what NASA had found down there, and that my grandfather had been part of it. I had to find out. Before leaving the study, I took the notebooks, the map, and the photograph with me. The next day, I returned to work, my mind spinning with the discoveries from my grandfather's house. The photograph, the map, and the notes felt like pieces of an incomplete puzzle, breadcrumbs leading to something too big to ignore. If there were answers, they'd be at NASA, the very place where my grandfather had worked and where, decades later, I just started my career. I arrived at the main building and followed my usual routine. Badge at the security reader, quick greetings to colleagues in the hallway, and a strong cup of coffee, the only constant in any scientist's life. But that morning, I felt an unusual restlessness, like a faint hum in the back of my mind. During lunch, I snuck into the records center, a cold, spacious room where physical and digital archives coexisted like relics from two different eras. NASA's system is organized but complex. Thousands of projects, years of research, and mountains of data. I knew exactly what to search for, but when I typed in keywords like Mariana Trench, underwater expeditions, or submerged program, the computer screen returned access denied, or worse, file not found. It made no sense. Not even a mention. Carter, what are you doing here? The voice made me jump. I turned to see Mason Green, a veteran scientist who'd been with NASA since the 1980s. He was the type everyone respected, but who rarely paid attention to newcomers. Looking up something. Old, I said, trying to sound casual. Something about underwater missions from the 60s. Mason frowned, as though I'd mentioned something forbidden. He studied me for a moment, then crossed his arms and tilted his head, almost smiling. Some doors are closed for a reason, Carter. What do you mean? Just an old friend's advice. If it's not in the records, maybe it's better left alone. He turned to leave but stopped at the door, speaking without looking back. Sometimes, not every question deserves an answer. When he left, I sat there staring at the computer screen, processing those words. Some doors are closed for a reason. Of course, that only made me more curious. Later, back at my desk, I couldn't focus on anything. Mason's warning echoed in my mind like a relentless hum. He knew something, and his evasiveness confirmed that there was more to those investigations than I had imagined. Then my computer emitted a low sound, an email notification. I opened my inbox and froze. The sender was anonymous, just a random sequence of letters and numbers. The subject line read, Operation Abyss 12. My hand hovered over the mouse. There was something unsettling about the email. There was no body text, only an attachment. The file was just over 200 megabytes, labeled op_abyss12.zip. I glanced around. The room was nearly empty, the silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. Taking a deep breath, I double-clicked the file. Took a while to open. When I finally extracted the contents, there was a single corrupted video file. I tried playing it, but the image flickered with static and skips. Still, I could make out a few details. For a brief moment, a title screen appeared, black with white capital letters. Operation Abyss 12, Field Recording. The date in the corner read 1967. The video skipped to what looked like underwater footage shot from some kind of vehicle or capsule. The images were grainy, but I could see the dark walls of an oceanic trench, illuminated only by artificial lights. The camera shook slightly, as if there were turbulence in the water. In the corner of the screen, the indicators displayed an absurd depth over 10,000 meters. The image abruptly cut out, replaced by distorted audio. Muffled voices mixed with mechanical noises. I tried adjusting the sound, but it was too damaged to make sense of. The last thing I managed to see was a series of numbers and words flashing on the screen, almost too fast to read. I paused the video, stepping through it frame by frame until I froze on the image. There they were, coordinates. 11 degree 21.0 foot N, 142 degree 12.0 E. My heart raced. I knew those coordinates. They were right in the heart of the Mariana Trench. I closed the video and leaned back in my chair, my head spinning. Who had sent this? And why? The name Operation Abyss 12 had never appeared in any public NASA documents. If that video was real, it meant the agency had not only explored the deepest point in the ocean but also had something to hide. What had they found down there? The question hammered in my mind as I copied the files to a flash drive. I shut down the computer and slipped the device into my pocket, gripped by a strange urgency to protect the information. Mason was right. Some doors are closed for a reason, but I was already on the other side. There was no turning back. I knew I couldn't move forward alone. The corrupted file was a puzzle beyond my skills, and if anyone could recover lost data, it was Lena Park, a brilliant programmer and one of the few friends I had made since joining NASA. Lena had a knack for hacking into unhackable systems and retrieving data that was meant to stay buried. When I entered her makeshift lab in the basement, she was sitting in front of 4 monitors, surrounded by motherboards, tangled cables, and half-empty coffee mugs. If you're bringing a virus into my system, Nathaniel, I swear I'll kill you, she said without looking up. It's not a virus, I replied, taking a seat next to her. It's something I found, let's say, off the books. I need your help recovering it. That caught her attention. Lena paused, peering at me over her thin-framed glasses. Off the books. Way off. I handed her the flash drive. Lena plugged it into her computer without hesitation, which surprised me. She was usually more cautious. A loading bar appeared on the screen, followed by the file name, op_abyss12.zip. What is this? She asked, already opening the contents. Something related to the Mariana Trench 1960s. A secret NASA expedition. The file's corrupted, but it has video and audio. I want to know what really happened. She let out a low sigh and started working. I probably shouldn't even be listening to this, she muttered. But I do love a good mystery. The hours dragged by as Lena ran the file through a series of recovery programs. The room was filled with the intermittent sound of her typing and the constant hum of computer fans. I sat there, tense, watching the screens as if answers would leap out at any moment. Finally, Lena leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses. I managed to recover a few parts. What? The video? Fragments of the video and some audio clips. But there's still a lot that's unusable, she explained. It looks like someone deliberately damaged this. My throat went dry. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what she had found, but there was no turning back now. Show me what you got. The recovered video started with a familiar sequence. The title, Operation Abyss 12, field recording, and the date, 1967. After that, the image flickered, but Lena had stabilized it. It was underwater footage shot from inside a submersible, a dark capsule illuminated only by external lights. Muffled voices could be heard in the background, likely the mission team speaking from the control room. A male voice came through. Depth, 10,922 meters. We're at the bottom. Visibility is limited. It looks empty. Another voice responded, distorted by static. Confirmed. Keep recording. Look for any signs of anomalous activity. For a few seconds, the video showed only an endless expanse of darkness. The camera captured the sandy, cracked floor of the abyss, illuminated in ashen tones. It was an oddly tranquil image, but something about that stillness made me deeply uneasy. Suddenly, the audio cut out, replaced by a series of sharp, high-pitched sounds and muffled screams. Lena paused the video and looked at me. That's as much as I could recover from this section. What are those screams? I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. I don't know. It seems like they came from the submersible. The audio recording was overlaid with some kind of interference. And the rest? Lena adjusted the video to a later point in the timeline. The image now showed the interior of a facility, likely a NASA installation. Men and women in lab coats were either sitting around a table or moving hurriedly in the background. One of the scientists, a thin, older man with thick glasses, stood and spoke directly to the camera. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed something else: fear. Contact with Team 3 was lost at 4:37. The submersible disappeared from radar without explanation. There was no identifiable technical failure. The camera trembled as another man, off-screen, asked a question I couldn't make out. The scientist hesitated before responding. They heard something down there, something alive. The video abruptly ended. The screen went black, and silence filled the room. I looked at Lena, who seemed as shaken as I was. They lost an entire team? I asked quietly. She nodded. And there's more. While I was recovering the video, I found fragments of an encrypted report. I could only piece together parts of it, but it was enough to know what happened next. What? All records of this expedition were archived and then erased from NASA's systems. The names of the scientists involved have been completely wiped. It's as if that team never existed. I sat in silence, trying to process what she was saying. Someone silenced them, I murmured. Lena looked at me seriously. Nate, I don't think you should keep digging into this. If they erased these records, it was for a good reason. I ignored her warning. My grandfather had been involved in this operation, and now I knew that an entire team had disappeared without a trace. It wasn't a technical failure. It wasn't human error. They had found something down there, and someone had made sure the world would never know what it was. As I left Lena's lab, clutching the flash drive with the recovered files, the only thing echoing in my mind was that phrase from the video. Something alive. I didn't sleep that night. The recovered video, the audio fragments, and what Lena had uncovered played in my head like a broken record. A missing team, names erased from history, a NASA operation that had simply vanished from existence. And that haunting phrase, something alive. The next morning, as I stared at the old map I had taken from my grandfather's house, I realized I finally had a solid piece of the puzzle. I had overlooked it before, but now it seemed to challenge me, daring me to look closer. I spread it out on my desk, running my fingers over the fragile, yellowed paper. The coordinates were almost erased, scratched out as if someone had tried to obliterate them, but I could still decipher them. 11 degree 21.0 foot N, 142 degree 12.0 E. I grabbed my laptop and opened a geolocation program. I entered the coordinates and watched as the digital map zoomed in on the middle of the Pacific Ocean. A single point appeared, marked precisely in the center of the Mariana Trench. There it was, the deepest place on Earth, a fissure in the ocean floor over 11,000 meters deep. To anyone else, it might have been just another insignificant spot on a map. But I knew that in the 1960s, NASA had a reason for sending a mission there. What had they been searching for? And what had they found? I spent the rest of the day poring over public records, searching for any clue about NASA's operations in the area. The Mariana Trench is frequently mentioned in modern scientific articles, usually as a technical challenge or a point of interest for marine biology. But as I dug deeper into the past, a pattern began to emerge. During the 1960s, there were numerous mentions of scientific agencies' interest in the ocean depths. Those years, remembered for the space race, also held a lesser-known fascination with the sea. Submersible projects, high-pressure research, and deep-sea studies were common. But then, in 1967, the year of the video Lena recovered, everything stopped. References to underwater operations dwindled. Shortly after, they disappeared entirely. Promising projects were suddenly terminated without explanation. Renowned researchers abruptly left their positions, some retiring prematurely, others vanishing from public life. Most disturbing of all, any document or article that specifically mentioned the Mariana Trench or nearby regions had been systematically erased from historical records. It was as if, at some point, a deliberate effort had been made to erase that point on the map from memory. I wasn't uncovering answers. I was uncovering a pattern of erasure and redirection. During a break, I sat and opened the last notebook I had taken from my grandfather's study. Most of it was filled with incomprehensible scribbles, graphs of underwater pressure data, and small maps. But in the middle of the pages, I found a note written in trembling letters, almost like a warning to himself. "The depths are not meant to be explored." I froze, staring at that sentence. My grandfather, one of the greatest scientists of his time, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge, was warning against the very act of exploration. Why? I continued flipping through the notebook until another detail caught my eye. On one of the last pages, he had drawn something that looked like a symbol, a circle with crossed lines, similar to the one I had seen in the old photograph of the research team. Beneath the symbol, he had written, "Operation Abyss 12. The eyes must not see." That phrase perfectly captured the sense of erasure I'd been noticing in the records. This wasn't just a secret, it was a prohibition, a deliberate effort to hide something from the depths, something that perhaps wasn't meant to be seen. But why? I picked up the map again and stared at the coordinates. The Mariana Trench sat there, quiet, silent, and yet it seemed to scream at me. NASA may have abandoned its missions, but whatever was down there remained, untouched, and I needed to know what it was. Before leaving the office that night, I did something I shouldn't have. I used an internal NASA system, not unlike a search engine, but one that provided access to older and less cataloged files. I typed in Mariana Trench and began browsing through the sparse results that appeared. I didn't find anything directly linked to the 1960s program, but I did stumble upon a small text file from 1966, signed by a name I didn't recognize. It was a brief note, probably lost in the system. Anomalies recorded. Exploration team reports unidentified low-frequency sounds. Equipment malfunctioning. Recommend suspending studies in the area until further notice. Potential unknown risk. The message seemed almost bureaucratic, but the use of the words anomalies and potential unknown risk sent a chill through me. I closed the file and shut down the computer, glancing around to make sure I was alone. No one seemed to notice what I was doing, but for the first time, I began to wonder if I should continue. I wasn't being followed. There were no invisible eyes tracking my movements, but the weight of meddling in something forbidden began to settle on me. As I drove home that night, I mentally replayed everything I knew so far. NASA secretly explored the Mariana Trench in the 1960s. A team vanished during Operation Abyss 12. All records had been erased, as if they had never existed. Something down there made them stop. But what? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew where they were. At the bottom of the trench. That night, I went over the fragments of the report and the scratched-out coordinates on the map again. The Mariana Trench was still at the center of everything, but I knew there were more pieces to this puzzle, hidden somewhere. The systematic erasure of information, the reports of anomalies, and the disappearance of an entire team pointed to something much larger and far more dangerous than I was prepared to face. Before going to bed, I decided to review my grandfather's old map one more time. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, and that's when I noticed it. In the lower right corner of the map, almost erased by time, was a small penciled note. Theta Facility, 1966. Containment, Westport, California. Westport, California, was a small coastal town near the Pacific, practically forgotten on modern maps. The name Theta Facility hadn't appeared in any of the documents I'd researched so far, but it seemed like a solid lead. Why would my grandfather have marked that place? And what did he mean by containment? The next day, I requested 2 days off from NASA. It was a risky move, but I needed to follow this lead while the trail was still warm. I drove for hours, navigating the winding roads of California until I reached Westport, a sleepy village that seemed frozen in time. Weathered wooden houses, salt-worn fishing boats stranded on shore, and nearly deserted streets. No one seemed to notice me as I parked the car. The exact location of the Theta Facility wasn't clear, but the map pointed to an isolated area atop a cliff to the north of town, shrouded in dense forest. It was the kind of place no one would visit without a specific reason. With a backpack and flashlight, I followed the rough trail indicated by the map. The crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots and the salty tang of the sea were the only signs of life around me. The wind carried a sharp chill, even under the faint morning sun. After nearly an hour of hiking, the terrain began to change. The forest opened into a clearing, and there it was, the forgotten base. The Theta Facility was a cluster of low buildings, all corroded metal and cracked concrete, as if abandoned decades ago. Thanks to its remote location, the base remained mostly intact, a ghost of the Cold War era. As I approached, I became acutely aware of the oppressive silence. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves. It was a heavy, stifling quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath. The main gate had fallen, and the central building's steel doors were twisted, as though someone or something had ripped them off. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The interior of the base was dark and cold. The ceiling leaked, and moisture had taken over the walls. Rusted equipment was scattered across the floor, along with moldy papers and broken furniture. The empty rooms gave the unsettling impression of a place abandoned in a hurry. I made my way to what seemed to be the main operations room. An old command board covered an entire wall, lined with buttons, levers, and obsolete monitors long since dead. On a metal table in the center of the room, I found something that made my heart race. A stack of burned reports, eerily similar to the ones I had seen in the recovered videos. Carefully, I sifted through the papers, separating the readable fragments. Most were incomplete technical logs, but one scribbled phrase caught my attention. Failures in APIS sounds detected at 11,000 meters. Last transmission. Something is watching. My blood ran cold. APIS I knew that APIS was an advanced version of the bathyscaphe trieste, but until that moment, I hadn't found any clear mention of it in the archives. Now, I had confirmation. NASA had used that submersible in Operation Abyss 12. But what had they found down there? As I sifted through the papers, something on the opposite wall caught my eye. Someone had scrawled a phrase in large, dark letters, almost as a warning. Something awakens in the silence of the depths. The words buzzed in my mind like a constant hum. I glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of the absolute silence inside the base. I continued searching the remaining rooms until I found what appeared to be a technical archive, stored in a partially destroyed cabinet. Among the papers was a detailed diagram of the APIS submersible, outlining its systems, crew, and research equipment. But what truly grabbed my attention was the final report attached to the project. APIS dispatched to the Mariana Trench in 1967. Objective: exploration and data collection at extreme depths. Last recorded transmission at 4:37. Communication lost. Submersible not recovered. The report's final lines were clear and deeply unsettling. Project terminated. Directive: discontinue all research in the region. Classification: confidential, I closed the report and took a deep breath. NASA had abandoned the Apis Eye and the Mariana Trench itself shortly after Operation Abyss 12. Something had happened down there, something that made them leave everything behind, erase the records, and silence those involved. When I left the base, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The cold Pacific wind blew strongly, but the silence of that place clung to me like a shadow. I had the major pieces of the puzzle now: the map, the Apis Eye submersible, and the confirmation that something had been discovered at the bottom of the ocean. Something that should not have been disturbed. But one question lingered, refusing to let go. What really happened to the crew of the Apis Eye? And, more importantly, what did they see down there? Returning home after visiting the Theta facility wasn't what I had expected. Instead of answers, it felt like the questions had multiplied. The Apis Eye, the phrase on the wall, the reports of sounds and anomalies. Everything pointed to something so enormous it was impossible to ignore. Yet with each discovery, I found myself questioning whether I truly wanted to know what was hidden in those depths. I decided it was time for a new approach. Up until now, I had been searching through documents and abandoned facilities, but perhaps it was time to speak to someone who had actually been there. That's how I began looking for the names of those involved in Operation Abyss 12. It wasn't easy. As I already knew, many records tied to the mission had been erased. Even so, thanks to my internal access at NASA, I managed to sift through old administrative files. Most of the names associated with the operation were just identification numbers, empty entries that led nowhere. But one name caught my attention: Dr. Arthur Whitaker. First, it seemed like an error. The records indicated that Whitaker was one of the engineers involved in building the Apis Eye, but he was also listed as part of the mission's support team. Stranger still, his involvement in the operation abruptly ended without explanation right after the 1967 expedition. Unlike the other names, however, Whitaker's record hadn't been completely erased. With a little effort, I was able to find a current address. Dr. Arthur Whitaker was alive. He lived in seclusion in a small cabin in Washington state, hidden among dense forests near the coast. 2 days later, I was driving toward Whitaker's home. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by towering trees that seemed to block out the sky. The address led me to a rustic wooden cabin, surrounded by makeshift fences and an overgrown garden. At first glance, the cabin looked abandoned, but a thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney. I took that as a sign that someone was home. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the door. I waited. The forest around me was unnervingly quiet. After a moment, the door creaked open. An elderly man appeared, frowning. He wore an old, patched sweater, and his sunken, weary eyes studied me with suspicion. "Who are you?" he asked in a raspy voice, gripping the door as if ready to shut it again. "My name is Nathaniel Carter, Dr. Whitaker. I work for NASA." At the mention of NASA, I saw a change in him. His hands trembled slightly, and his expression grew darker. "I haven't worked for NASA in a long time, kid. You've come to the wrong place." Before he could close the door, I grabbed the frame and pressed on. "Please, I just want answers. I know you were part of Operation Abyss 12. I need to know what happened." He hesitated, studying me as if trying to decide whether I was crazy or worth his time. Finally, he opened the door a bit wider. "Come in." The inside of the cabin was simple and dimly lit, illuminated only by the glow of a fireplace. The entire house felt frozen in time, filled with old furniture and stacks of dusty books. He led me to a small living room and gestured for me to sit in a worn armchair while he took a seat on the sofa across from me. "I don't know what you've heard," he began, staring into the fire, "but you should forget it. Nothing you're looking for will bring you any peace." "I can't forget," I said firmly. "I found records, fragments of reports. You were part of the team, Dr. Whitaker. You were there when it all happened." He stayed silent. "It was a long time ago," he muttered. Too long. I leaned forward, my chest tight. But you remember. I know you do. Please, Dr. Whitaker, tell me what happened. At last he looked at me. His eyes held a mix of sadness and something else. Fear. You really want to know? I do. He laughed bitterly, a sound more like a sigh. It wasn't human, kid. He paused, as if the words weighed heavily on him. The bottom of the ocean isn't for us. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just said. It wasn't human. What do you mean by that? I asked, but he shook his head. That's all you need to know. If you're smart, you'll forget everything and move on with your life. NASA went too deep and we paid the price. He stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Frustrated, I rose too, feeling like I had come all this way for nothing. Then why doesn't anyone talk about it? Why did NASA erase all the records? Because no one should know, he said, guiding me to the door. Before he opened it to send me off, he hesitated. He turned back, looking at me for a moment, then walked to a wooden bookshelf in the corner of the room. He retrieved something and returned, placing it in my hands. A small, dusty journal with worn edges. I can't tell you anymore, but maybe this will help. The journal felt old, its pages yellowed and some torn. Something was etched into the cover, APSI mission logs. Before I could thank him or ask anything else, he opened the door and motioned for me to leave. Be careful what you're looking for, kid. Some truths are deeper than they should be. I drove back down the winding road with the journal on the seat beside me. His words echoed in my mind. It wasn't human. Now I had another piece of the puzzle, possibly the most important one yet. A journal that might contain answers or at least clues about what really happened at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that journal would cross a point of no return. Back at my apartment, I placed the dusty journal on the table. For a moment, I just stared at it, as if I could divine its contents without even opening it. Felt heavy, not literally, but because of everything it seemed to represent. A fragment of the past that someone had deliberately kept hidden. The journal was small, its leather cover cracked, and its title hand-etched. Operation Abyss 12 base log. Those words immediately made something clear. The journal belonged to someone who had been stationed at the monitoring base, observing the mission in real time. Someone who had watched it all unfold and documented it. I carefully opened the first page, feeling the rough paper beneath my fingers. February 15th, 1967, Theta Base. Monitoring APSI. The mission began at dawn. APSI was launched into the sea as planned. Control team on high alert. Communications stable. The capsule is well equipped, and the crew seems confident. The weather is calm, the ocean cooperative. Perhaps this will be the only peaceful moment we'll have. The handwriting was firm, methodical, like that of someone accustomed to writing technical reports. But as I read on, the tone began to shift. February 15th, 1967, 9:45 a.m. APSI has passed 5,000 meters. Everything normal so far, except for minor interference in the sensors. Nothing unusual. The team believes it's just a calibration issue due to increasing pressure. But it's too early for problems. February 15th, 1967, 12:30 p.m. Depth, 9,000 meters. We heard the first sound. We can't identify it. The audio engineer said it's likely a technical glitch, but that's not what I heard. The sound was low, deep, like a muffled roar, something drawn out, coming from somewhere in the depths. Transmission was unstable for a few minutes but recovered. We reported it to the team, but no one seems concerned. I paused. A roar? At 9,000 meters? Even through the journal, I could sense the writer's hesitation, as though they knew something was wrong but didn't want to admit it. I kept reading. February 15th, 1967, 1:45 p.m. Depth, 10,500 meters. Sensors picked up something unexpected. Movement, small at first, almost imperceptible, but then more distinct. Something was shifting. We don't know what it is. There's no recorded life at these depths. We're trying to recalibrate the sonar, but the readings remain erratic. February 15th, 1967, 2:15 p.m. The sound returned, louder this time. The tech team thinks it might be vibrations from the capsule or echoes of ocean currents, but that doesn't make sense. The sound is irregular, doesn't follow any pattern. My impression is that it's something alive. I reported it to the mission director, but I was dismissed. The priority is to maintain calm. The handwriting began to change here. It was more pressed, as though the writer was scribbling quickly, trying to record events without losing track. February 15th, 1967, 3:05 p.m. Depth 11,000 meters. Visual contact reported. Apis eyes, external cameras caught a shadow. It was too quick to analyze, but it was there. A massive shape moving beyond the light's range. One of the operators whispered that it looked like a living mountain. Communication with Apis Eye's crew was interrupted for a few seconds. There was static on the radio, followed by complete silence. When the connection was restored, the commander's voice sounded different. My throat went dry. Different how? I turned the page, noticing that the writing was becoming increasingly rushed. The author was scribbling more than writing, the words nearly illegible in some places. February 15th, 1967, 3:30 p.m. The shadow returned. Sonar detected movement. Too large, too fast. We couldn't keep the signal for more than a few seconds. Something passed near Apis Eye. The capsule shook. The last audio transmission was recorded before contact was lost entirely. The journal quoted the final words from the crew. There's something here. It's too big. My God, it's colossal. The sound returned. The roar. I don't know how to describe it. It's like the ocean itself is screaming. I turned to the final page. The sentences were spaced farther apart, as though the writer was hesitating. February 16th, 1967. There's no longer any signal from Apis Eye. We've tried making contact all night, but it's useless. The mission has been terminated. No one talks about it. The director gave orders to archive everything. Burn the reports. Silence the team. Pretend it never happened. I saw the recordings before they were erased. The shadow was there. Massive. Something that shouldn't be at the bottom of the sea. It wasn't a technical failure. It wasn't a mistake. It was real. God has abandoned us in the depths. I closed the journal with trembling hands. The final phrase burned in my mind, as though it had been written directly for me as a warning. God has abandoned us in the depths. Someone at the monitoring base, a scientist, an observer, someone like me, had seen the signs. They heard the roar, saw the shadow, and then they watched everything get erased. Operation Abyss 12 wasn't a technical failure or just another mission gone wrong. It was an encounter. Whatever that colossal shadow was, something no human should ever have seen. It was there at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Something alive. Something that had made NASA abandon its exploration of the depths. Leaning back in my chair, I felt the walls of my apartment closing in on me. An idea began forming in my mind. If the Apis Eye disappeared, then it was still down there. And if I wanted answers, the answers no one else was willing to give, I would have to find it. At the bottom of the trench, where God doesn't reach. But that was a foolish idea, impossible even. I was still trying to process the journal's contents when my phone vibrated on the table. The sound was almost a relief, a break in the unsettling silence that had filled my apartment since I closed those last pages. It was Lena. "Nate," she said the moment I answered, skipping any pleasantries. "I need you to come over. I've restored another part of the corrupted audio." "You did? What did you find?" I asked, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. I'm not sure how to explain. You need to hear it. Her tone was different. Lena prided herself on her technical prowess and rarely seemed rattled. But now there was a tension in her voice that made me leave the apartment almost immediately. Lena's workspace was, as always, a chaotic haven of technology. Monitors flashed endless streams of code, while the hum of servers filled the room with a soothing white noise. She sat at the center, surrounded by screens, and looked at me seriously as I entered. You really need to hear this, Nate. She swiveled her chair and adjusted the controls. One of the monitors to her right displayed the file name, apis_I_transmission_02. I managed to recover audio from one of the last transmissions sent by Apis I before contact was lost, Lena said. The quality is still terrible, but there's something there, something that doesn't make sense. Play it. She nodded, took a deep breath, and clicked on the file. The sound began faintly, filled with intermittent static and mechanical noises, the kind you'd expect from an old recording, especially one captured at the ocean's depths. Metallic creaks echoed through the speakers, the groaning of the submersible's hull straining under the crushing pressure. Among these noises were distant murmurs, muffled voices from the crew, almost inaudible. Lena increased the volume, and the room was filled with sound. Depth, 11,000 meters. Structure stable. No anomalies. The voice was male, steady but with a subtle tension I couldn't ignore. This was followed by a sharp crackle like electrical interference, and then silence. A second later, the sound came. A deep roar. I flinched instinctively, closing my eyes. This wasn't an ordinary sound. It wasn't mechanical or the result of interference. It was alive and yet incomprehensible. It seemed to come from everywhere, a low, resonant frequency like the muffled echo of an endless thunderclap. My God, I murmured. Lena looked at me, her expression tense. That's not all. Keep listening. The audio continued, filled with more metallic groans from the submersible, the creaks growing louder as if the Apis I was being shaken. A voice rose above the noise, distant but panicked. Do you hear that? Do you hear it? It can't be. Another roar followed, louder this time. My body tensed, goosebumps running from head to toe. The sound seemed to reach out from the speakers, carrying a frequency so deep it felt tangible, vibrating against my skin. Then another voice, closer and clearer, took the microphone. It's just one thing. It's impossible. The phrase seemed to dissolve into the chaos that followed. Deafening noises filled the recording, static, high-pitched screeches, and what sounded like something massive slamming against the submersible's metal hull. These weren't regular impacts. It was as though something was trying to crush it. And then, abruptly, it all stopped. The file ended in stark silence, leaving the hum of Lena's servers as the only sound in the room. She paused the recording and looked at me with a grave expression. It's just one thing? I repeated, trying to make sense of it. That's what he said. Apparently, the crew saw something down there. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. But what did he mean by just one thing? I asked, more to myself than to her. Maybe. Lena hesitated before continuing. Maybe they were talking about its size. Not something small or fragmented, but something singular, something immense. The thought made me shiver. Up until now, I had assumed the reports of the colossal shadow might have been a series of misunderstood or exaggerated phenomena. But the recording suggested otherwise. Something was down there, something so massive the human mind might not be able to fully grasp it. The roar, I murmured. That's not a natural sound. Lena nodded. No known life form could produce a frequency like that, let alone at a depth of 11,000 meters. I tried analyzing the sound's wavelength, but the pattern. She paused, searching for the right words. It's as if the sound was too large for the recording to capture. Like it echoed from somewhere even deeper. The idea made my stomach drop, as though the ground beneath me had suddenly given way. Something deeper, something larger. I leaned back in the chair, running my hands over my face. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we had just heard. The recording left no room for doubt. The crew of Apis, I saw something. They heard something. Something colossal, impossible to ignore. Lena broke the silence, her voice low and uncertain. "What are you going to do now, Nate?" I lifted my head slowly, still trying to process everything. "I need to understand what they found," I finally replied. "Not just the official records, but everything. Ancient accounts, myths, legends, anything about colossal creatures or sounds from the depths." She frowned. "You think there's a connection?" "I don't know, but there has to be. Things like this don't just come out of nowhere. We're not talking about faulty technology or coincidences. This is real, Lena. It has to be in the oldest stories, the tales people told before modern science tried to explain everything." She was quiet for a moment, just watching me. Finally, she sighed and shook her head. "Just be careful. The people who buried this won't like seeing you dig it up." "I know," I said, grabbing the flash drive with the recording. As I left, the words from the audio kept echoing in my mind. "It's just one thing. It's impossible." And that deep roar, resonating like thunder from a place where the world was supposed to be silent. I had to uncover the truth. Whether it was in lost archives or ancient stories, the answers were out there, waiting for me. Back home, my mind churned with possibilities. Lena was right. What I was digging into wasn't meant to be disturbed. But it was too late to stop now. I began searching for answers where facts ended. Myths, ancient texts, and the stories people told when they had no other way to explain the unexplainable. If something colossal and alive existed in the ocean's depths, someone, somewhere, must have described something similar. That's when I came across Leviathan. The Leviathan appears in biblical texts, described as a colossal sea monster dwelling in the ocean's depths. In the book of Job, it is portrayed as an unbeatable creature with impenetrable scales, terrifying teeth, and a power that even the bravest warriors could not challenge. In Psalms, the Leviathan is tied to primordial chaos, a destructive, uncontrollable force that only God could defeat. One verse from Job in particular struck me. "No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me? Its breath sets coals ablaze, and its eyes are like the rays of dawn." The description was as vivid as it was terrifying. This wasn't just an animal. It was something greater, a primordial force representing absolute chaos. More than that, the Leviathan was often interpreted as a symbol of nature's untamable power, something humans could neither control nor comprehend. I kept reading about its origins and significance. The Leviathan was seen as a remnant of ancient times when the world was ruled by monsters and chaotic forces. Many texts suggested that it wasn't just a creature, but a manifestation of the abyss itself, a guardian of Earth's deepest secrets. It made me think of the phrase scrawled on the wall of the base: "Something awakens in the silence of the depths." What if the silence they referred to wasn't just literal? What if it was the silence of forgetting, something that had always been hidden until Operation Abyss 12 disturbed it? I continued my research, delving into Norse mythology, where I came across something equally unsettling: Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. In Norse myth, Jormungandr was a gigantic serpent that lived in the ocean, so massive that it encircled the entire world and bit its own tail. Its name literally means world monster, and it was a central figure in Ragnarok, the prophecy of the end of the world. According to the myths, Jormungandr was a creature of chaos, a destructive force that, when awakened, would bring about total annihilation. The idea that it lay dormant in the ocean depths until the right moment was eerily familiar. One specific detail caught my attention: the roar. In some versions of the stories, Jormungandr emitted a terrifying sound that reverberated across the world, heralding Ragnarok. Like the Leviathan, the Midgard serpent wasn't just a physical creature. It represented something greater, a manifestation of chaos lying at the bottom of the world. And both creatures, when awakened, would signal the end of the world. I spent hours poring over articles, texts, and translations, searching for a connection. With each page, the parallels between these ancient myths and the fragmented reports from Operation Abyss 12 became more striking. Leviathan, Jormungandr, I murmured to myself, jotting down details in my notebook. Both figures were colossal, associated with the ocean's depths, and described as forces beyond human understanding. Even more disturbing, both seemed to be creatures that humanity was never meant to disturb. I remembered Dr. Whitaker's words, "It wasn't something human. The bottom of the sea isn't for us." And then I thought again about the phrase on the base's wall, "Something awakens in the silence of the depths." That was it. It wasn't just a creature. It was something that personified chaos, something the ancient legends tried to explain. Something that had always been there, but humanity had the sense to fear. NASA, however, lacked that sense. As I looked over my notes, I began to realize that to the ancients, Leviathan and Jormungandr weren't just monsters. They were warnings, representations of something they couldn't fully comprehend but instinctively knew to leave alone. And now I had more questions than ever. If Leviathan or Jormungandr were ancient interpretations, what was really down there? And what did Operation Abyss 12 do to awaken it? I knew I had to keep going. Maybe the ancient texts held more answers, or perhaps there were other accounts in mythologies I hadn't yet explored. But one thing was certain. Whatever NASA had found in the depths wasn't something to be disturbed. And yet someone had. Lena called me the next morning, her voice tinged with urgency. "Nate, I found something. You need to see this. Now." I rushed to the lab, where Lena was surrounded by screens, cables, and scattered notes. The energy in the room was different. She seemed both exhilarated and nervous. "What did you find?" I managed to restore more of the APSI footage. It's not much, only 5 seconds. But I think it explains everything. She adjusted one of the monitors and hit play. The video was fragmented, static, distorting parts of the screen, but I could clearly see the inside of the submersible. The crew was silent, the external spotlight illuminating the abyss outside. The silence was oppressive, and then the camera panned slowly, capturing something in the distance. A shadow. It was enormous, moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, at the edge of the darkness. I leaned in, trying to decipher what I was seeing, but the recording ended abruptly. "That's it?" I asked, frustration and fascination warring in my voice. Lena shook her head. "No." I enhanced and processed the final frame. "The shadow isn't just a shadow, Nate. It has structure." She typed something and the image froze on the video's last frame. At first glance, it was just a blur, but with the filters Lena applied, outlines began to emerge. And then I saw it. The creature. It was colossal, beyond human comprehension, its body covered in something that looked like a mix of scales and bony plates. Parts of the image hinted at massive fins or appendages moving with slow, deliberate purpose. But what struck me most was what seemed to be its head. Serpentine with hollow, predatory eyes, like those of a creature that hadn't seen light in millennia. "My God," I whispered. Lena pointed to a detail she had zoomed in on. "Look at this. Those aren't just scales. Some of the patterns look like inscriptions, runes, or markings. Something carved into it, maybe like it was marked by something ancient," I said, feeling a chill run down my spine. At that moment, the truth finally clicked. NASA hadn't found just another animal. This wasn't an unknown species or a biological anomaly. It was Leviathan, or at least what the ancients had called Leviathan. Every culture that mentioned it gave it a different name. Tiamat, Jormungandr, Rahab. A monster that lived at the boundary between reality and myth, waiting in the ocean's depths. And my grandfather knew. He knew that NASA's silence, the abandoned expeditions, and the erasure of records weren't just about hiding a mistake or a failure. It was about protecting the world. because if Leviathan were fully awakened, the consequences wouldn't be a matter of scientific curiosity. They'd be a matter of survival. Lena and I kept digging, cross-referencing every piece of data we could find. Finally, in an archive of old files, we came across what appeared to be the final report from Operation Abyss 12. It was a lengthy document, full of technical jargon and hurried descriptions, but its message was clear. Anomalies detected. Seismic movement originating from the submersible's presence. Direct interference with the abyssal floor resulted in localized tremors and geomagnetic failures. The report detailed how the Leviathan seemed to respond to the presence of Apis I. The team couldn't determine whether the vibrations were a form of communication or merely a reflex of something far deeper. But the critical point lay in the final page. It is recommended to cease all activity in the Mariana Trench. Interaction with the environment appears to have awakened something that was in a dormant state. The risk is incalculable. This operation must be terminated immediately and all records destroyed. There was also a handwritten footnote at the bottom. It is not natural. It is not ours. NASA's focus must remain on the stars. Far away from this, Lena read the report alongside me in silence. When we finished, she simply closed the document and looked at me. Now it makes sense. It all makes sense. NASA didn't abandon the ocean floor due to a lack of interest. They fled. They realized the ocean's depths were as vast and mysterious as space, but infinitely more dangerous. I spent hours reflecting on everything we had uncovered. The roar, the shadow, the tremors, the accounts from ancient cultures. It all pointed to a simple, terrifying truth. The Leviathan, or whatever it was there, deep within the abyss, waiting. And if it were ever fully disturbed, there was no doubt about what would happen. If you are reading this, know that there are places on Earth that were not meant to be explored. Places where forces beyond human comprehension lie dormant. It is no coincidence that NASA redirected its gaze to the stars and left the ocean floor behind. Because the day the Leviathan fully awakens will be the end of us. For now, the Leviathan remained asleep. But for how long? That was the question that would haunt me forever.